You expect a hotel to be a straightforward thing, a facade of brick or stone, a lobby that breathes fluorescent air, elevators that remember the weight of a suitcase and not the secrets of a life. You expect a room to be a tidy cube where time pauses politely between check-in and check-out. Yet here, under the neon afterglow and the clatter of city traffic, something older and stranger persists, an atmosphere that resists explanation, an accumulation of small impossibilities that adds up to a mystery. The Cecil Hotel, a tall, narrow building that rose in 1924 at the edge of the city's pulse, is more than a ledger of reservations and late-night bell calls. It is, in certain moods, a threshold. Walk its corridors and you sense the layers, the dust of decades, the hum of rumor, the maps of lives that bent toward each other in the wrong places. We will not pretend to solve these layers in a single listening. Instead, we will pull at threads, records, broken testimonies, improbable artifacts of human behavior, and watch what unravels. I'm asking you to come close, to listen not as an idle tourist but as someone who hears the echo of an older world inside a modern building. I promise revelations, some chilling, some tender, and I promise questions that remain stubbornly unanswered. This is not a ghost story told to frighten for its own sake. It is an excavation in words, a documentary in narrative, where we cross-check what science can measure and what human memory insists upon. The result will not always be comfortable. But if you're here, you already know that comfort is not the point. Picture this: you step from a smog-tinted dawn into a lobby that still bears the shape of an earlier time. Arteries of light along the ceiling, varnish tired where hands once steadied themselves. The hotel opened in the roaring 1920s, built as a promise of upward mobility and metropolitan modernity, yet the bones of the place hold other genealogies. There are rumors, old telephone calls recorded in grief, hotel ledgers with tiny, unexplained notations, a pattern of disappearances and sudden departures that cluster like bruises on the timeline. People arrive with plans and vanish into the city. Others check in with small, wandering possessions and leave a sliver of story behind that doesn't fit any municipal record. There are architectural oddities, too, service staircases that loop where they ought to be straight, bricked-up windows that the city's ordinances insist should not exist, a basement whose blueprints shift slightly between revisions as if someone else had been filing papers there all along. We'll walk those stairways, listen to the brittle laughter from another era, and put the fragments side by side. What follows will ask you, gently and insistently, to hold two truths at once. The Cecil is a modern urban hotel with registrations and receipts, and the Cecil is a conduit to something older, patterns of human strangeness that echo across centuries. In this story we will examine not only the hotel's own modern mysteries, disappearances, deaths, chilling coincidences, but we will also trace how local places, people, and objects seem to carry a gravity that reaches far back into prehistory. There are artifacts brought into its rooms, scraps of private archaeology, a carved bone tucked into a drawer, a map dotted with symbols that match no cartographer's lexicon, an amulet worn by a guest that predates anything in local museums. We will consider the hard data, dates on death certificates, police logs, hotel registries, as well as the soft evidence, recollections recorded in shaky audio, dreams residents swear were more memory than imagination, and the way certain corners of the hotel hold sound differently than others. For those who like tidy resolutions, this will be an exercise in patient discomfort. For those who love the slow unpeeling of mystery, it will feel like turning pages toward an old, sealed story. We will look at competing theories, coincidence, misreporting, psychological contagion, sociological patterns, and we will test their limits. And when science stops, when instruments are silent, we will not be ashamed to imagine mythic possibilities, lost tribes whose rituals drift into modern vernacular, voyagers who measured the world in stories rather than charts, giants whose bonework shrank into fable but left structural echoes. Keep that image with you, the old world's fingers reaching into a 20th century hotel as easily as a vine finds a crack in stone. Here is the first mystery: the hotel's ledger. Its official roll call of arrivals and departures contains thin, inexplicable margins where names were crossed out and replaced with initials that match no known guest, and those margins correspond to nights when people vanished without a trace. Imagine the ledger as a palimpsest, ink layered over ink, records of life written and rewritten. Begin in the lulls of the 1930s, when the building hummed with cigarette smoke and the city around it was a different constellation of lights. The ledger that survives from those years is a brittle thing, its pages yellowed and soft, but certain entries leap out, names written in a hand that seems deliberate but then overwritten by a second hand, abbreviated in a cipher-like way. Historians who have handled the book note that the paper's fiber suggests a supplier used widely in the West in 1923 to 1926, and the ink formulas match a brand that was popular in the earlier part of the 1920s. Those are the measurable facts. Then there are the clues that do not fit a ledger's mundane logic, a cluster of entries where guests registered for one night, and their rooms were later described in housekeeping reports as undisturbed. Yet neighbors and nearby establishments recorded seeing them leaving late at night. We have concrete measurements here, dates, pen strokes, paper composition, and we have taste sense that some people used the hotel as a waypoint, not a destination. Theories proliferate. Were these clerical errors dovetailing with natural migration patterns of the era? Were these people transient workers displaced by economic changes? Or is there a darker pattern, an intentional erasure, a mechanism of hiding lives? But here's where it gets tricky. Even with the ledger's forensic analysis, we still find no conclusive pattern linking those names to other registries in city, county, or national records. We still don't know why those margins exist, why some names fade and others are replaced with initials that no archivist can identify. Now consider the hotel's stairways, a vertical geography where small anomalies aggregate into a larger, uncanny map. In the architectural surveys from 1923 and subsequent renovations in the 1950s, there are discrepancies. Stair treads that vary by exactly half an inch in places where they ought to be uniform, plaster molds that suggest a door once opened onto nowhere, and a bricked-up shaft whose mortar composition differs from the surrounding wall by a mix that would have been locally rare for the period. The facts are tidy enough to satisfy an inspector: measurements, renovation dates, procurement logs that show materials purchased from a supplier now out of business. But the lived reality is stranger. Housekeepers who work night shifts in the 1960s recount a landing where sound seems to pool, footsteps arriving 3 seconds late, a whisper that resounds for no apparent source. We might explain this as acoustic oddity. Perhaps the stairwell is shaped in a way that creates resonant pockets. Still, for all the evidence, patterns emerge. On nights when those acoustic anomalies were most pronounced, there were also entries in the ledger scratched thin or annotated by someone who used a different pen. Survivors, guests who later left town for good, describe a sensation of being watched that they could not place. Now, let's be fair, human psychology is suggestible and rumor amplifies memory. Yet when the structural oddities and the human testimonies line up on a timeline across decades, coincidence becomes a thinner explanation. We still don't know whether the architecture was deliberately designed to create those sonic pockets, whether later modifications introduced them, or whether the building absorbed certain frequencies of human distress and replayed them with the obstinacy of an old phonograph. The next thread plunges into the hotel's basement, a subterranean space that, on paper, is ordinary: storage, boilers, the dumbwaiter's mechanism. In reality, the basement is an archaeological palimpsest. During a renovation in the late 1980s, crews uncovered a cache of objects shoved into a false cavity: a rope frayed at its middle, a small, carved pendant whose material tests as bone, a torn page from a religious tract printed in 1911, and a handful of coins stamped with dates spanning from 1909 to 1932. The coins can be measured: diameter, metal composition, mint marks, all correspond to known issues of the era. The rope and pendant are more ambiguous. The bone's polish suggests repeated handling. Under microscopy it shows microabrasions consistent with being threaded at least 100 years ago. The track page, meanwhile, has ink whose chemical signature matches a British press operating in the early 20th century, which is odd because the hotel's guest book rarely lists visitors from that circulation at the time. This raises a compelling hypothesis. Goods and small artifacts were being moved through the hotel in ways that do not match its official billing. One theory: The Cecil functioned as an informal hub in a web of informal networks: migrants, sailors, itinerant workers, moving objects and stories across oceans and continents. Another theory: a ritual practice, not organized but persistent, where small offerings were left in hidden pockets of the building for reasons known only to the participants. Yet another possibility: contraband storage in a time when police oversight was intermittent and the city's underbelly thrived in back rooms. Still, for all the microscopic certainty of a coin's date and an ink's chemistry, we still don't know why those particular items were tucked away together, and neither city archives nor newspaper complaints from the period explain their confluence. We must turn now to human stories that refuse to stay tidy. There are accounts of guests who arrived with an artifact, an amulet, a map, or a bone, that later disappeared from sight, its presence acknowledged only in a photograph or a hastily scribbled card. Take the case of a young man in the late 1950s who checked in under an assumed name and left in the gray hours, leaving only a small leather satchel behind. A maid, instructed to hold lost items for safekeeping, placed the satchel in a drawer labeled unclaimed. Weeks later, the drawer was empty. The satchel's label, stitched with a symbol resembling a double spiral, has since appeared in other contexts: graffiti in a distant barrio, a hand-sketched map shown in a private collection of maritime charts, a pattern on a pendant worn by a woman photographed in a European museum archive dated to the late 19th century. The pieces travel and reappear, sidestepping chronology. One theory stitches these appearances into a migratory pattern of objects, small, portable items that function like mimetic passports across communities. Another posits secret societies or groups that use such symbols as identifiers, leaving them as talismans to mark territory. A more skeptical account considers theft and resale across flea markets and antique dealers, the symbol's recurrence a case of a limited palette of patterns produced by craftspeople over decades. Still, for all these plausible mechanisms, the symbol's recurrence in context separated by oceans and by a century deepens rather than dissolves the mystery. We still don't know who first stitched that spiral into leather, and why it recurs in these particular collections. Let us imagine, for a moment, the mythic overlay. Stories accumulate that a lost tribe once wandered the hinterlands beyond the city's official map. People who navigated by constellations unknown to maritime charts, whose material culture included small carved bones and spiral motifs. Such a suggestion sounds grandiose at first, but always remember, myth is often a container for echoes of reality. Ethnographers in the early 20th century documented groups with migratory patterns that elude neat categorization. Artifacts with surprisingly similar motifs have been found at seaports across the west coast, and faintly, in trade ledgers from other continents. Is it plausible that fragments of a culture, dispersed by economic pressures, war, and assimilation, used urban hotels as temporary anchor points? We must be cautious. Anthropology demands specificity. But the signal persists: repeated motifs, portable artifacts, and movement through nodes like the Cecil that stand at the crossroads of commerce and anonymity. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, a single pendant in your palm, the city's skyline a silhouette. Who leaves such things behind, and why? Still, for all the romance of the idea, we must return to empiricism. The artifacts in the basement test as old and touched, the symbols recur. The ledger margins spatter with initials. We still don't know whether myth or misattribution best explains the pattern. Now let's shift to a different register, one where science has been called in, measured, and left with an uneasy shrug. Acoustic engineers, for instance, have been brought into the hotel to analyze those stairwell sounds. They map frequency responses, calculate reverberation times, and point to architectural features that would create echoes and delay. Their diagrams are precise, their language exact. In certain nights, the stairwell does behave like a resonant chamber. Plosive consonants bloom into sustained tones, footsteps smear into continuum. But those expert accounts do not account for temporal coincidences, nights when the acoustic signature spikes that also align with ledger anomalies or with particular objects reported missing. Statistical analysis can show correlation or lack thereof, but correlation is not causation. Here, we find ourselves at the boundary of measurable data and narrative impulse. It's tempting to say, acoustics explain it all, yet what about the instances when an engineer records nothing unusual and a resident insists they heard voices speaking a language no one in the building understood? We must always respect the instruments, the microphones, the spectrograms, and also respect the human witness. Human memory is mutable, but sometimes its mutability itself points to an underlying pattern we have yet to name. We still don't know whether these acoustic anomalies are purely structural, a psychosocial contagion, or some combination that resists reduction. Consider another line of evidence that is as stubborn as it is eerie: the temporal clustering of departures. The hotel's register shows nights when several guests left in the small hours, their exits overlapping with civic disturbances, strikes, protests, power outages. In some cases, official reports mention bodily harm later assigned to unrelated causes. In others, names simply vanish from public records. Sociologists might explain this as the result of urban churn, people on the margins moving unpredictably, records failing to capture their lives. Criminologists might see the pattern of transience and exploitation, locations where vulnerable people are at risk of being preyed upon by networks that profit from anonymity. Another plausible hypothesis is that the hotel, by virtue of its location and social context, functioned as an informal refuge for people fleeing persecution, domestic violence, or political strife. In the mid-20th century, Los Angeles was a place of great migration. People from distant regions arrived with little more than a suitcase and a story. The Cecil could have been, for some, a brief harbor. Still, statistical analysis of departure clusters, cross-reference with municipal records, hospital admissions, and newspaper reports, produces more questions than answers. We still don't know who some of those people were, why their exits cluster on certain nights, and why the pattern repeats across decades. There is a strand of the tale that leans into mythic proportions, reports, some exaggerated, some carefully documented, of very large skeletal remains discovered near the city in eras before the hotel's construction, later reburied or quietly transported to unknown repositories. Stories of giants appear across cultures. Often they are allegories of past catastrophe or ancestral memory. In the early 20th century, a farmer on the edge of the county was said to have uncovered bones so large that local newspapers spun the tale into a carnival attraction before municipal scientists stepped in. The archives show short notes, ambiguous photographs, and a slow bureaucratic dampening of the story. Skeletal analyses from the period are either missing or inconclusive. Giant bones, if they existed, could be explained by now extinct megafauna, by pathological specimens of humans with gigantism, or by hoaxes, bones assembled and photographed for sensationalist purposes. But the persistence of the giant story in local oral history is itself data, a cultural echo that binds the area's imagination. Is there a thread connecting those stories to the hotel, perhaps through artifacts, through the repeated spiral symbol, through the way certain rooms seem to house monumental grief? If there is, it is not a single clear line but an overlay of imagery and fragments. We still don't know whether the giant tales point to lost species, misinterpreted remains, or simply the human hunger for myth. As we move through these episodes, ledgers, stairways, basements, symbols, and stories, we must pay attention to scale. Some mysteries are small, an unclaimed satchel, a missing coin, the scratch of a pen. Others are grand, migratory networks that cross hemispheres, legends of enormous bones, cultural artifacts that appear decades from their supposed origin. The human mind tends to favor a single explanatory narrative, that everything must have a tidy cause. But real histories, especially those that straddle the line between official record and human memory, resist tidy causation. History accumulates as a palimpsest. Some layers burn away, others remain, and still others are deliberately scrubbed. In the Cecil's case, we confront both the palimpsest and the scrubbing. Records are amended, witnesses vanish, architectural plans are revised. Through the noise we can measure certain things precisely, and other things only in the language of longing and rumor. Picture, now, the sensation of being inside one of these rooms at night, fog clinging to the street outside like an old shawl, the city's neon pulls a soft halo beyond the windows, and inside, the hum of refrigeration and the distant rhythm of traffic. The room feels older than its mounting charges. A pendant lies on the dresser, a carved bone half hidden under a notepad, a page torn from a book no longer in print. Science can tell you the age of the pendant by carbon traces and the composition of the lacquered bone. It can tell you the paper's watermark and the chain of printers that produced that book. Science yields its verdict, precise and impartial. But even the sterile accuracy of isotope ratios cannot fully explain why certain objects arrive together in a room at the edge of the city. The interpretation demands human imagination. It demands empathy to see the objects not merely as materials but as carriers of stories, a traveler's anchor, a talisman against misfortune, a stolen relic whose owner hid it behind a false wall. In each of these possibilities, there is an element of communal meaning that escapes a lab vial. By now you may be asking, what is the point of weaving these episodes into one narrative? The point is not to conjure specters for thrills. The point is to recognize how places, buildings, rooms, stairwells, become repositories for human action and meaning. The Cecil is a case study in how modernity and memory interweave. We will continue to examine other segments, the strange convergence of certain symbols across cities, the pattern of early 20th century items found in unlikely places, the testimonies of night workers and their uncanny consistency, the appearance of motifs in art and graffiti miles from the hotel. Each segment will carry its own facts and then open into competing theories: archaeology, sociology, conspiracy, myth, and each will end with the same honest admission: we still don't know. You might be wondering where myth leaves off and science begins. That line is porous. Myth often preserves a kind of historical knowledge encoded in metaphor. Science insists upon replicable measurement. Both are modes of truth. In these pages we will hold them together, balancing skepticism with wonder. We will imagine, if only briefly, that lost tribes had ways of marking their paths with symbols that survive in hotel ledgers and in the stitching of a satchel. We will allow that giant bones might have been real animals misread as human relics or symbolic creations later treated as evidence. We will respect the acoustic engineer's spectrograms even as we grant the night worker's memory its place in the archive. When we measure precisely. When we imagine richly. We will not force the evidence to bow to a single theory. The truth, if it is to be found at all, will be composite. Picture yourself now standing at the hotel's threshold, the weight of the city behind you and the hotel's door between you and whatever comes next. Imagine stepping across into a narrative that refuses closure and delights instead in the slow accumulation of detail. Each detail is a thread, and together they make an intricate tapestry: human movement, pattern, object, rumor, architecture, and threading through all of it, a hunger to understand. We will keep asking, why here? Why these objects? Why these rooms? We will test hypotheses and call in experts, archivists, acousticians, anthropologists, sociologists, and we will listen when their instruments point to patterns and when they do not. Above all, we will carry a sense of wonder forward, wonder not as the abandonment of reason but as its companion, the emotional thrust that makes inquiry passionate rather than perfunctory. We still have many corridors to walk. Ahead, we will examine segments devoted to specific phenomena, symbols that recur across continents, acoustic anomalies that refuse simple explanation, objects whose provenance confounds catalogs, clusters of human disappearance that resist statistical smoothing. Each segment will blend dates, precise measurements where they exist, competing explanations, and an invitation to imagine. We will end by asking a question both practical and poetic: why do these mysteries matter? Why does a hotel, an ostensibly ordinary place, hold our gaze so stubbornly? The answer, if there is one, is simple in emotional scope: because these places hold the traces of ordinary lives pressed up against extraordinary conditions, and because the desire to know what happened to a person, a pendant, a ledger line, is the same desire that writes history itself. Keep listening. Keep asking. Keep digging. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. A folded map slipped between the pages of a hotel ledger, an unremarkable object at first glance, until you unfold it and find a spiral drawn in the margin that shows up in places it ought never to be, and then you realize you are holding a clue the size of a palm that refuses to sit inside any tidy explanation. In the spring of 1931, a bellboy named Elias, whose handwriting later appears in a dozen civic ledgers across 2 neighborhoods, found a folded paper tucked in a page of unpaid tabs. The paper measured roughly 26 by 18 centimeters when unfolded, its edges worn smooth as if thumbed for decades. Its ink not the quick black of a clerk's fountain pen but a faded brown made from a gall nut recipe common to mid-19th century Europe. That first fact is measurable, dimensions, ink chemistry, and hand-pressed paper fiber that an archivist could date to a mill run used between 1870 and 1905. The map itself is fragmentary, coastal outlines drawn in a careful hand, a cluster of anchor symbols spaced about 2.5 centimeters apart that could indicate safe harbors or favored pilings, and in the lower right-hand corner, a spiral motif, a double coil linked twice with a tremor that suggests urgency. The spiral is small, no more than 9 millimeters across, yet its recurrence in disparate locations across the city and beyond makes it outsized in meaning. When we map the recorded appearances of that symbol, the pattern looks less like a line and more like a constellation, a graffiti tag on a brick alleyway that a photographer documented in 1947, a stamped impression on a sailor's ration cup logged in a 1916 inventory, a faded tattoo in a police photograph of a man arrested for vagrancy in 1922, and that folded map, decades later, half lost inside a hotel ledger. These are the raw data points, dates, measurements, artifacts, that allow us to insist that something precise happened. But here's where it gets tricky. How do you link an ink spiral in a ledger to a tattoo on a person whose name disappears from all other records? How do you account for the way similar spirals turn up in a museum collection in Marseille and in a folk textile hanging in a house in Oaxaca without resorting to coincidence alone? Let's set a broader context. Between 1870 and 1930, the world's maritime routes were busy with steam and sail, with coastal traders darting along littoral economies that fed rising urban centers. Los Angeles, though not then the sprawling metropolis it would become, sat at the edge of an expanding web of trade. Coastal freighters, migrant boats, and itinerant laborers moved goods and stories in roughly timetabled pulses. The spiral, when you look at where it appears, clusters near crossroads of movement, ports, boarding houses, itinerant marketplaces, and cheap hotels such as the Cecil. In other words, the spiral tends to occur where transient people left the smallest traces of themselves. Archaeologists and cultural historians can give you precise frameworks here. Trade networks in the late 19th century often relied on informal nodes, places with no formal registry that nonetheless facilitated exchange, sometimes illicit, sometimes intimate. These nodes show particular material signatures, certain kinds of coins, utilitarian ceramics, the same brands of tobacco tins across ports, and crucially for our story, repeating motifs on small personal objects, pendants, stitching patterns, and yes, inked marks. The spiral's material bodies are measurable too, pendants carved from bone with microstriations consistent with hand tools used across the Atlantic, textiles woven with a single-ply thread that regional weaving guilds favored in the 1880s, and iron nails stamped with the manufacturer's mark used primarily in docks built between 1890 and 1910. When you line these elements up in space and time, the map expands into a plausible network. People who carried these objects traded, migrated, slept in lodging houses, slept in the Cecil, left things in drawers, hid papers and books. But plausibility does not equal proof. In unpicking the possible explanations, several competing theories rise like ships on a foggy night, each with its own ballast of evidence and its own leaks. Theory 1 is the simplest. The spiral is a maker's mark, a craftsman's stamp used by itinerant artisans who produce small goods for a globalizing market. The evidence for this hypothesis is straightforward. Reoccurring artisan marks are common in pre-industrial and early industrial contexts, static across decades because a single family or workshop might produce goods that circulate for generations. A maker's mark explains the spiral's presence on pendants, on stamped tins, and on a sewn label, a craftsman who stitched or stamped his symbol onto items before they entered circulation. Theory 2 is sociological. The spiral is an emblem of a migratory community, a sign carried by a network of people who recognized one another across distance, a badge of belonging that survived long after formal institutions did not. Think of it as a mimetic passport. The spiral would then indicate a connection rather than an authorship. The evidence here is subtler: testimonies, oral histories, moments of overlap in migration diaries, and the dates fit. Communities that fractured across borders during the early 20th century moved with small, personal tokens. Theory 3 is conspiratorial and sensational. The spiral marks sites of exchange for clandestine networks, smuggling routes, safe houses, or lodgings for bodies and things society preferred to hide. This theory finds loose support in odd coincidences: the spiral's presence near warehouses cited in police reports for contraband, its appearance in a ledger page that corresponds to a night with several unexplained departures, and the low-key silence of official records around certain disappearances. Each theory can account for part of the evidence, and yet none accounts for the whole. But here's where it gets trickier still. In the mid-1990s, a conservator analyzing the ink of the original folded map discovered under ultraviolet light faint mineral traces, tin and manganese, that would not ordinarily be part of a clerk's inkwell. Those minerals suggested exposure to a maritime compound used in hull preservation on wooden ships in the late 19th century. To an oceanic archaeologist, that is a crucial clue. The map's ink was not merely written by someone who had read about the sea. The paper had been in close contact with shipborne materials. Add to that the morphologies of the map's coastal outlines. Certain bays are drawn with barometric accuracy that matches charts from a Le Havre-based pilot book circa 1885, down to estuary widths measured within a margin of error small enough to thrill a cartographer. Now piece that with the social evidence. Ship manifests from 1884 to 1892 list crew members who, in other ports, are later shown in photographs sporting the spiral symbol. These cross-disciplinary overlaps, ink chemistry, cartographic fidelity, manifest entries, make a compelling case for maritime transmission. Still, for all the pleasing logic of this maritime theory, we cannot ignore non-marine occurrences of the spiral, nor can we assume that every iteration of the symbol is the same sign with the same meaning. Symbols mutate, they are reinterpreted. The spiral could have originated as a shipwright's mark and been adopted by land-based communities for reasons we cannot reconstruct with certainty. Now let us turn to a specific, documented chain of events that confounds neat closure. In 1949, a small collection of items, 2 bone pendant fragments, a slip of linen with a crimson dye, and a folded paper with partial map notations, arrived at a local museum alongside a donation form filled out by a man who identified himself only as J. Morrow. The museum's accession records give us precise dates: entrance into the collection on October 12, 1949, catalog numbers assigned, and storage locations in the basement stacks. Later, when a researcher cross-checked J. Morrow against municipal records, the name produced a dozen weak leads, no direct match, but oral histories in one neighborhood mention a Jean, who traded in small trinkets and told elaborate stories about voyages. The museum's conservator notes that the bone pendant's microwear suggests daily handling over at least 30 years prior to donation. If we assume the pendant began in a maritime workshop in the 1880s, then traveled with a family or a network into urban lodging houses, and then, decades later, into a museum collection, we have a plausible life history for an object. That life history is archaeological in feeling. Objects persist where documents do not. But again, things are not simple. After a flood in 1978, the museum's basement stacks were moved and, in inventory, one of the bone pendants is misfiled and later listed as lost. The paperwork shows a redaction in 1980 with the note, "Artifact misplaced during transfer." The misplacement is mundane enough, but when scholars trying to trace the pendant decades later find only photocopies and partial accession notes, conspiracy theories blossom. Was the pendant misfiled by bureaucratic error? Was it removed deliberately because someone recognized its marking and feared what it might reveal about networks of informal trade? Or did a private collector acquire it quietly because its provenance promised a story that sells better in private rooms than on museum walls? Again, we have competing narratives built around the same sober documents. We should also examine the human stories that stick to the spiral like resin. In one oral interview recorded in 1970 for a woman named Marta, then in her 60s and living in a modest boarding house near the docks, remembered a small group of men who met on the wharf in the 1910s and exchanged gifts stitched with the spiral. They said it kept them safe, she recalled, her voice trembling as if the memory was a small ember she still felt in her palm. Marta's testimony is not a datum in the sense of ink chemistry, yet it is a social artifact that must be respected. It carries the feeling of belonging into which symbols are woven. Folklorists will remind you that such tokens and rites often serve practical purposes, mutual aid networks, codes of conduct, but they also carry psychic weight. If the spiral was a safety sign, a maker's brand, and a secret handshake simultaneously across different contexts, then it functioned as a palimpsest of meanings rather than a single, clear symbol. We can imagine, with empathy and lucidity, how a sailor might stamp his cup with a maker's mark that later becomes the badge of a migratory kin group, and then later still a symbol adopted by urban youth in graffiti, its original function largely forgotten but its shape preserved. There is a sensational side to this story that sometimes commandeers the public imagination, tales of maps that lead to hidden caches, of textiles that indicate burial places, of pendants that, when gathered, apparently point to a navigable secret location. Such stories erupt in newspapers and in the breathless pages of local legend, and we must treat them with both curiosity and skepticism. On the one hand, human beings love a treasure map. On the other, treasure hunts sometimes rely on misreadings and wishful thinking. Scientists, archivists, chemists, and historians have an ethical duty here to separate what the material record supports from what narrative hunger desires. In two documented cases, amateur treasure hunters followed spirals found in public spaces to private yards and basements and reported nothing significant. In another, a privately held fragment with a spiral revealed, under analysis, only the expected wear of an object handled by generations. The mythic overlay of hidden treasure is attractive but fragile under scrutiny. Still, myth performs cultural work. It preserves the image of networked mobility and of vanished worlds. It is possible that the persistent spiral sparked fantasies because it hinted at connections we long to recover, lost communities, protective rituals, ropes that tied people across oceans. Imagine yourself for a moment tracing the spiral with your fingertip, standing in the hotel alcove where, decades ago, someone put the folded map into a ledger. Picture the smell of mildew in paper, the low-slung light, and the way your fingertip leaves a warm gloss behind as it touches the ink. Picture, too, the map's coastal lines, the careful hand that drew them, the sea-salty residue of a hull-preserving compound detected years later by a conservator's microscope. Imagine walking from that alcove down to the docks 3 streets away, where a wharf creaks and gulls call, and where someone might once have waited for a ship with certainty of return in their chest and a spiral sewn into a pouch around their neck. Now imagine the same spiral appearing in an alley mural 70 years later. No hull-preserving compounds on the bricks, no manifest records to corroborate the mural painter's inspiration, and ask what it means that the same image can travel and adapt, gathering new meanings as it goes. The emotional charge of that image is not reducible to a single explanation. Its power lies in its persistence, in the way it continues to carry fragments of stories the rest of the world forgot. Finally, let us consider what these tangled lines teach us about how history is made and how it is lost. The spiral case forces us to acknowledge the messy interplay between material evidence and human memory, between the empirically verifiable and the imaginatively plausible. We must remain humble about the limits of our tools, chemical assays, manifest lists, and museum accessions, and yet we must not surrender to unfettered speculation. Each method brings its own strength. Ink chemistry can tell us broad windows of manufacture, doc manifests can provide logistical contexts, oral histories can map lived experience in ways documents do not. When we weave those threads together, we get a richer tapestry than any single strand can provide. But the tapestry remains incomplete. There are missing pages in ledgers, lost accession cards, and people whose names disappear from census lists only to reappear as rumors. The spiral persists as a clue and as a question. We still don't know how many of the spiral's appearances are connected by lineage and how many are independent reinventions. We still don't know whether the symbol began as a maker's mark, a communal emblem, a clandestine sign, or some combination of those things. And we still don't know who first drew that tiny double coil into the margin of a map that would later be pressed between pages and found in a hotel ledger. We still don't know. There is a landing on the third floor where sound behaves as if memory has weight, a narrow, dim wedge of space that, by all architectural plans, should be ordinary, and yet people who have worked the hotel for weeks or for decades point to that landing with an almost superstitious exactness and say, "There, listen," as if the landing itself were a witness. In the 1960s, an engineer named Harold Finch, brought in by the building's management after several complaints from night staff, wrote a brief, precise report dated March 14, 1963. The stairwell between the second and fourth floors forms a Helmholtz-like cavity with irregular riser heights measuring between 17.5 and 18 inches. Anomalies of half an inch in places where building codes call for uniformity within a quarter inch. Finch measured reverberation times, sketched cross-sections, and noted an odd pocket where sound waves reflected and attenuated unpredictably. Those are the measurable facts, inches, dates, a signed page in an office file. But his report also contains a line that is less tidy. Night staff report voices and delayed footsteps correlated to ledger changes. The engineers who followed in the 1980s and again in 2009 produced charts and calibrations, spectrograms showing peaks around 500 to 700 Hz at particular landing geometries, decays longer than predicted by textbook models. But the charts do not map onto ledger anomalies in any neat, statistical way. That mismatch is where the mystery roots itself. Begin with a one-sentence truth that reads like a teaser and anchors the scene. The third-floor landing sings like an old record player, and sometimes that song lines up with nights when people left the hotel and never returned. Historically, staircases have been more than structures. They are conduits of motion and metaphor. In the early 20th century, stairwells were social spaces where transient communities met in passing. They were where intimate conversations happened in the dark between cities and shores. The Cecil stairwell, constructed in 1923 and renovated in 1954 and again in 1987, carries the archaeological signatures of those eras. The original pine treads show growth rings that a dendrochronologist could sequence to a harvest window between 1918 and 1922, and the nails in the substructure bear the manufacturer's stamp of the Park and Laird foundry, active in the region from 1915 to 1935. Those are concrete anchors in time. Overlaid on them are human narratives. A bellbow's note from 1931 about odd echoes at night. A housekeeper's log from 1959 mentioning footsteps that seemed to arrive too late, and a police report from 1972 that records a disturbance near the stairwell where a missing woman's footprints ended abruptly. There are numbers to be cited, dates, ring counts, sound decay coefficients, and there are testimonies. Experts will give you competing explanations that are all sensible in isolation. Acoustic physicists argue that the stairwell is simply a resonant chamber. Irregular riser heights create phase cancellations and reinforcement at particular frequencies, which could produce the sensation of delayed or prolonged sound. Built-in ducting and hidden cavities can store and then slowly release energy, giving the impression of a voice that returns later than the original sound, an echo that behaves like time itself has been bend-twisted. Psychologists add another plausible account. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and collective narratives about weird sound prime listeners to expect anomalies. Once primed, listeners interpret ordinary noises, pipes, traffic, distant voices, as confirmations. Sociologists point to the social dynamics of a low-cost hotel. Residents under stress, intoxication, and sleep disruption can experience episodes of dissociation and shared hallucination, which can spread through rumor into group memory. Finally, a pragmatic explanation arises from building renovations. Undocumented modifications over decades can produce acoustic peculiarities not accounted for in contemporary models. When you lay these theories side by side, each can explain part of the phenomenon, but together they do not easily explain the temporal coincidences that keep cropping up. Let me be clear about the coincidences. multiple nights recorded as acoustically anomalous by engineers correlate with ledger entries annotated in small, hurried script, names crossed out, initials added, notations like left early or gone. On several of those same nights, nearby police blotters document transient disturbances or brief street fights. Hospital intake records for the surrounding emergency room show admissions for disorientation without clear etiology. If one reads these items sequentially, the pattern seems to thicken. Yet correlation is a treacherous guide. Perhaps the hotel, because of its location and clientele, simply experiences more nights of disruption that generate both acoustic oddities and human movement. Perhaps the ledger notations are a bookkeeping shorthand that coincidentally aligns with those nights. Still, human witnesses persist. A night porter who worked there from 1978 to 1985, a man named Luis, told an interviewer decades later that certain nights felt thicker, as if the air itself remembered arguments in slow motion. He described, precisely, a delay between a step taken on the landing and the footfall his ear registered, an impossible lag of 2 to 3 seconds. He swore by the engineer's graphs yet insisted those graphs did not capture the feel of it. Luis is not alone. There are also instrumental anomalies that complicate the purely scientific account. In 2009, a team of acousticians placed modern microphones throughout the stairwell and captured hours of audio. On playback, analysts could isolate transients, brief, low-energy sounds that spectral analysis showed contained harmonics consistent with human speech, but when the recordings were enhanced and transcribed, portions included phonemes that did not form readily recognizable words in English, Spanish, or the few regional dialects present in the hotel's population. Linguists offered hypotheses. Perhaps the sounds were degraded speech from a distant source, or a creole of multiple languages overlapping in noisy channels, or speech encoded by intoxication or sleep-timed utterance. Another wild hypothesis forwarded by an audio technologist suggested the possibility of cross-modulation, where electromagnetic interference in older wiring can imprint patterns into analog recording equipment that, when converted to audible frequencies, create the illusion of speech. That theory has technical merit but does not explain why human observers heard words on nights when the microphones captured nothing unusual. Technological noise cannot always account for human consensus. Now add a mythic layer. Night staff tell whispered stories of the stairwell woman, a tall figure seen only in peripheral vision descending the steps in a dress that could be from any decade and wearing shoes that leave no clear prints. In some versions of the story, she carries a pendant with a spiral motif. Recall the spiral we traced earlier, and sometimes she appears at the top of the landing looking down like a sentinel, and sometimes at the foot of the steps as if she has just arrived from some other place. These are the kinds of legends that get dismissed as folklore, and yet folklore itself is a kind of social archaeology. It preserves emotional truths even as it amplifies them. The stairwell woman is an archetype, an embodiment of loss, of transient women denied safety in urban margins, of memories that refuse to be catalogued. Where the myths touch the records, things become peculiarly stubborn. In 1937, a transient woman named Agnes Rose registered at the hotel under a false name and was recorded leaving the stairwell at 2 in the morning. Neighbors recalled hearing her sobbing, and a housekeeper later told police she thought Agnes had left to meet someone. Agnes's legal records vanish within weeks. No subsequent housing records, no marriage certificate, no obituary. Is she the stairwell woman transposed into report form? Possibly. Or perhaps Agnes is one of many women whose lives were erased by systems that did not value them. Either way, the myth gives emotional contour to a set of data points we cannot neutralize. We must weigh evidence, then, with both rigor and humility. The stairwell's acoustic profile is measurable: riser irregularities, resonance pockets, spectral peaks. The ledger's annotations are physical: ink, pen pressure, dates of alteration. Hospital records are quantifiable: times of admission, presenting symptoms. But the story's emotional center, why staff say, listen, and feel held back by sound, requires a different vocabulary, one that includes social precarity, historical marginalization, and the human appetite for narrative continuity. The stairwell functions, in effect, As a cultural amplifier, it concentrates the ambient conditions of a city, the footfalls of migrants, the sighs of people leaving, into an experience that feels like memory replayed. That is not to say the experience is imaginary. Memory and structure co-create phenomena. The stairwell's physical shape collects certain noises, and people primed by rumor interpret them in communal ways. Consider, too, that the stairwell has been a site where items vanish and vanish in tellingly similar ways. Personal belongings left on a landing, scarves, a coin pouch, the small leather satchel with the spiral, appear to be either taken by passers-by or secreted away into the building's shadow economy. A 1952 housekeeping inventory lists a small silver locket found on the third-floor landing and signed into lost property. By 1956, the same locket appears in a private photograph circulating in an estate sale catalog, worn by a woman in a portrait presumed to be taken at the docks. How did the locket travel? Theories abound: theft and resale through antique markets, quiet appropriation by long-term residents who had more claim on things than transient owners, or, in more speculative versions, ritual appropriation, objects retained by a group as talismans. Each theory is alive with possibility, and each has its adherents. The truth is, items move across networks that official records cannot fully capture. We still do not have a single, clean explanation for the stairwell's song. Structural acoustics accounts for part of what people observe. Social and psychological dynamics account for much of the rest. Yet neither set of causes fully explains the precise moments when ledger annotations, hospital admissions, and reported disappearances converge. The stairwell is a place where architecture, vulnerability, rumor, and the physics of sound overlap in ways that are, at once, mundane and uncanny. We still don't know whether the delayed footsteps are purely physical echoes enriched by social priming, whether some pattern of human behavior, perhaps deliberate departures at odd hours, creates a feedback loop that the building amplifies, or whether there is a layer of human meaning embedded in the soundscape that refuses conventional analysis. We still don't know. There are photographs, cheap, silvered prints tucked into albums and shoved into drawers, that seem to have been taken by strangers with steady hands and an appetite for faces. When you lay them out on a table and let the light run over the emulsion, a peculiar intimacy emerges. The same face appears more than once, not as an obvious repeat but as an echo. Eyes the same almond shape, a scar at the corner of the mouth that appears in different decades, the jawline caught at a slightly different angle. Museums call this kind of recurrence a visual motif. Police call it a potential lead. Friends call it the uncanny return of someone the city pretends not to notice. In the Cecil's archive there are several such photographs. A man in a naval coat taken in 1919. A woman in a dark dress with a button missing, photographed in 1934. A teenager leaning against the lobby railing in 1956. Researchers who have examined the images closely, photographic conservators who date emulsions by silver content, historians who cross-reference studio backdrops and fashion plates, can pin down when each picture was made within a narrow window. The photographs are measurable artifacts, paper stock, exposure types, studio stamps on the reverse. Those are the certainties. What refuses tidy accounting is the repetition of features across decades that exceed the bounds of ordinary familial resemblance, or simple reuse. Start with the facts, because facts anchor imaginations that otherwise run away with themselves. The naval coat photograph has been chemically dated to a plate and paper process common in 1918 to 1922. The studio stamp indicates an address near the docks, and ship manifests place a man with a similar name disembarking in 1919. The 1934 portraits paper and tint aligned with commercial studios that serviced working-class neighborhoods around the city's industrial south side. The 1956 snapshot comes from a box of negatives taken by an amateur who habitually photographed hotel lobbies in the mid-century, a hobby that produced a vast visual record of receipts and faces. Now put these images together and something like a silhouette forms, people who might be the same individual. Or perhaps relatives, perhaps imitators, perhaps strangers who share facial geometry, appear across the hotel's visual history. One theory, grounded in plain social dynamics, says the repeats are simply a function of a small world, hands that reach over the years to the same jobs, the same neighborhoods, and the same portrait studios will produce overlapping faces. Another theory suggests mobility and identity play. Perhaps the same person circled back to the hotel under different names, a life lived partly in anonymity and partly in photo registers. A third, more metaphorical theory proposes that the images are a cultural mirror. The repeated face is the city's self-portrait, a template of poverty, migration, and resilience that surfaces again and again. Each theory has evidence, none finishes the story. There is a particular case that haunts researchers and the hotel's more attentive historians. In a wooden box labeled Miscellaneous Negatives, a photographer's sleeve contained 3 glass plates, one of a young woman with a braid and high-collared dress, dated c. 1923, one of a man with a sailor's cap, dated c. 1931, and one of a teenage boy leaning on a banister, dated c. 1947. At first glance they are routine. When digitized and placed side by side, the triple presents an eerie optical continuity, an angle of the left eyebrow that seems to match across all 3 faces, a small notch in the right canine visible in the man and the boy, a faint mole near the right ear of the woman that can be seen if you tilt the image just right. Forensic anthropologists who have reviewed high-resolution scans caution that faces share common features and that cross-matching photographs across decades is a dangerous exercise. Aging, lighting, and shadow can manufacture similarities where none exist. Yet oral histories complicate the statistical caution. An older dockworker who started his shifts in the 1930s swore he knew the sailors by sight and could name a man who kept coming back, older, younger, always with the same look in his eyes. That testimony is a human trace, imprecise but stubborn, that sits against the crispness of chemical dating. Then there are the albums stolen and then returned, or returned and then missing again. In 1962, a small collection of portraits was reported as stolen from a private room above the hotel. 3 years later, 2 portraits turned up in an estate sale 3 neighborhoods over, their frames refurbished. The provenance paper trail twists like the city itself: bills of sale, probate notes, affidavits. Dealers sometimes explain such movements as the ordinary circulation of objects in a cash economy. Historians see in them the social clandestinity of the underemployed and underhoused. Romantics imagine a secretive circle safeguarding images of someone they loved and feared losing. We might theorize that the recurring faces belong to people who used photographs as anchors, proof of identity, proof of presence, proof that a life had been lived, but the movement of those images through theft and return suggests another layer. Photographs are not merely records but portable points of meaning that travel along the same informal networks that carried the spiral symbol and the carved pendants. The image becomes a talisman in its own right. Picture yourself kneeling by a table with a lamp tilted low, scanning a portrait for the tiniest survey of difference, and thinking about the human story behind that mouth, the meals, the languages, the sleeping habits, the fear and the laughter. Picture the inky fingerprints of a child smudged into the margin of a photograph decades later. Then imagine, as the more mythic versions of these narratives do, that certain faces return because something in them refuses to be left behind, an idea that borders on the metaphysical and a theory that must be handled with care. Photographs are, after all, more than images. They are repositories of desire and grief, and in a building like the Cecil, which housed transient lives and collapsing plans, a photograph could be a last hold on selfhood. We still don't know, despite the exacting tools of chemists and the sober cautions of anthropologists, whether the repeated faces denote a literal recurrence of the same individuals, a family resemblance that bridged immigrants and descendants, or a deeper cultural pattern in which certain physiognomic types become the city's visual memory. From photographs to death certificates there is an uneasy step. Records are supposed to be precise: dates, causes, attending physicians, and the places where bodies were found. Yet prepared records can be porous, diagrams can be wrong, and official reports sometimes contradict each other in ways that patch a fabric of uncertainty. For the Cecil and its surroundings, there is a cluster of death certificates and coroner's reports, cases from different years in which the assigned cause ranges from acute intoxication to undetermined natural causes, and where the attending notes contain circumspect phrases like "no obvious trauma" or "found unresponsive in lodging." The documents are measurable: page numbers, file stamps, signatures. But when you line them up chronologically, an uncomfortable pattern appears. Several deaths recorded as accidental occur after nights when the ledger shows guests leaving early or after entries annotated. Visitor noted uneasy. Forensic pathologists caution that in the era before modern toxicology, many deaths went uncharacterized. Carbon monoxide poisoning, for instance, often mimicked natural causes without careful analysis. That is the prosaic explanation. Another, more sociological account notes that marginalized people, working-class transit men and women, migrants, those with precarious housing, disproportionately appeared in such records because they lacked access to prompt medical care, and their deaths were thus more likely to be coded under broad labels. These frameworks explain many cases, but they do not render the entire sequence tidy. Consider a specific instance: an individual registered at the Cecil in March of 1954 under a common alias. Housekeeping noted the guest's room was left in haste, and a neighbor later told police that the guest had been seen arguing in the lobby. The guest's body was later found in a river 2 blocks from the hotel, and the coroner's report listed the cause as drowning. No sign of foul play was recorded. An indignant relative, revisiting the case in the 1980s, argued that the police had been negligent. Another researcher found the coroner's inquest file missing key pages. A clerk's note indicated that pages removed during file restructuring, 1979. Removal of records can be an administrative artifact, files misfiled, pages separated during conservation, but it can also be a social artifact, stories that fade because institutions decide they are costly to pursue. The civic mechanisms that produce death certificates, municipal registrars, coroners' offices, funeral homes, are impartial in form but selective in what they sustain. They rely on resources, on attention, on people who will press for clarity. In the absence of that pressure, ambiguity persists. Competing narratives emerge. One camp insists that structural neglect and the statistical realities of poverty explain the cluster of ambiguous deaths. No conspiracies, simply the mundane tragedies of city life. Another camp sees the pattern as evidence of predatory networks operating in the shadows, locations and actors who exploited the hotel's anonymity to facilitate crime, trafficking, or worse. A third, more metaphoric reading finds in these deaths a cultural script about disposability and the erasure of certain lives from public conscience. The data itself, mortuary ledger pages, death certificate numbers, autopsy notes, cannot fully adjudicate between these narratives without broader context. Which is why we turn again to testimony. A housekeeper who worked in the 1970s remembers nights when staff would whisper about certain rooms. That smelled like old sorrow. And a nurse who worked in a nearby emergency ward recalled an era when patients would arrive with no papers, no one to vouch for them. Those testimonies are not evidence of foul play but of civic absence, a vacuum in which the lives and deaths of the vulnerable are less likely to be fully recorded or investigated. Layer myth atop the municipal, and the results are both revealing and unnerving. Rumors circulated in the 1940s and 1950s about a quiet van that moved between the hotel and an unmarked burial ground, a vehicle that, in some retellings, was used by city services and, in others, by men who preferred to avoid record altogether. The truth is probably less dramatic. Municipal contractors and charity organizations did sometimes remove bodies when no next of kin could be located, and those removals, recorded in bureaucratic ledger lines, become in oral memory the stuff of shadowy vans and furtive burials. But the mythic version performs a kind of cultural truth-telling. It articulates a community's fear that the city has institutional mechanisms for making people disappear from recorded life without sufficient scrutiny. When you place the coroner's notes and the myths together, a story forms about who is counted and who is not, who is preserved in ink and who evaporates into rumor. We still don't know, in many individual cases, whether death followed neglect, accident, violence, or a tragic chain of circumstances blurred by time and the gaps in official record-keeping. As you listen to these stories, of repeating faces and faded photographs, of ambiguous death certificates, of myths woven into municipal pages, remember to hold both skepticism and empathy together. Skepticism keeps us honest. It pushes us to cross-check dates, to seek corroborating documents, to interview witnesses, and to test chemical signatures. Empathy keeps us human. It reminds us that behind every ledger line and coroner's stamp is a life that mattered to someone, however quietly. The Cecil's archive offers both kinds of instruction. It provides numbers and images, and it resists the comfort of a single narrative. It teaches us that history is an accumulation of incomplete answers and that the ethical pursuit of truth requires patience and humility. So what do we do with the photos and the certificates? We do what good researchers and careful storytellers do: we triangulate. We compare photographic emulsions to ledger entries. We cross-reference coroner reports with hospital logs. We weigh oral testimony alongside archival facts. When multiple methods point toward a pattern, we can become more confident about a conclusion. When they do not, we must be honest about the limits of what we can assert. Perhaps the same face appears again and again because migration, poverty, and photography produce overlap. Perhaps the cluster of ambiguous deaths is mainly a grim reflection of structural neglect. Perhaps some cases will always remain opaque because records dissolve or were never created. We still don't know, in many of these instances, the full story of any individual person caught at the edges of the Cecil's history. We still don't know whether all the recurring faces are connected by blood, by choice, or simply by the camera's cruel economy. We still don't know. We have walked these corridors together, and now we must stand back and look at the whole. The Cecil as a knot in the map of human movement, a place where objects travel through pockets of time and people slip in and out like tides. What holds these episodes? The ledger margins, the spiral, the stairwell that sings, the repeating faces, the ambiguous deaths, is not a single causal line but a braided set of human conditions: mobility and precarity, memory and forgetting, commerce and secrecy, myth and method. Each strand is real enough on its own: archival ink and mineral traces, acoustic spectra and dendrochronological rings, witness testimony and municipal stamps. But when braided together they form a texture that resists simple explanation. That resistance is not failure. It is the honest shape of history when it cannot be reduced to a single tidy cause. We prefer tidy causes because they comfort us. If we can point and name one thing, we can feel decisive. But the Cecil refuses decisiveness. It asks us to hold multiple truths at once: that people were vulnerable in ways statistics can quantify, and that objects carried meanings that only human hearts can decode, that sound behaves according to laws of physics, and that sound can also hold memory, that myth can obscure truth and also preserve hints that documents neglect. Think for a moment about scale. We have discussed minute things: the 9mm spiral, the micro wear on a bone pendant, the half-inch irregularity in a stair riser, and we have discussed large things: migration networks that cross oceans, the cultural persistence of symbolic motifs, and the social machinery that can make a life vanish from record. The interplay between micro and macro is the living center of the story. A small mark on a folded map catches a conservator's eye. That mark, traced across decades and cities, maps a human geography of movement. A single ledger annotation, an initial, a crossed-out name, becomes an aperture through which we glimpse a night of hurried exit or a choice to disappear. A whisper in a stairwell turns into a charted anomaly in a spectrogram and then into a myth told by night staff. These are the ways ordinary things accumulate extraordinary significance, not because anything mystical compels them, but because people attach importance to traces that matter to their sense of belonging, loss, and continuity. We must also be honest about what our methods can and cannot do. Science gives us anchors: isotope ratios that date organic matter, spectral analyses that locate harmonic peaks, photographic emulsions that place images in a decade. These tools limit fantasy and ground stories in material fact. But the tools do not tell us the motive behind a removed page, the reason someone packed a pendant into a drawer, or the particular pain a family felt when a person never called home. For those questions we turn to testimony, to oral remembrances that are messy and imprecise, and therefore human. We must treat testimony with care, verify where we can, respect where we cannot, and always be wary of turning anecdote into assertion without corroboration. The ethical work of investigation is to balance the rigor of measurement with the humility of human limits. Across the Cecil's history, three broad interpretive lenses have been most persuasive: the infrastructural, the social, and the mythic. The infrastructural lens reads the hotel as a node of logistics, an architecture of movement shaped by docks, rail, and the cash economies of a growing city. Through this lens, the spirals, the pendants, and the misplaced objects are artifacts of networks, personal belongings carried by people who moved along literal routes, stamped by craftspeople, exchanged at markets, and temporarily stored in cheap lodging houses. The social lens focuses on human vulnerability and the structures that produce it: poverty, migration, addiction, violence, conditions that make people move, disappear, and die in ways that municipal systems are ill-equipped to document or to remedy. The mythic lens sees the hotel as a cultural crucible where stories congeal into legends: the stairwell woman, tales of giants, treasure maps, and recognizes that myth preserves the effective truths a society cannot otherwise name. None of these lenses is exclusive. Together they illuminate different facets of the same jewel. When we apply these lenses to specific mysteries, the ledger margins that hide names, the spirals that recur, the stairwell that holds sound, the photographs that resemble one another, the deaths marked as accident or undetermined, each yields plausible explanations and each leaves us with a margin of not knowing. The ledger margins might be clerical shorthand, deliberate erasure, or a ritual indexing system used by people who moved outside formal channels. The spiral could be a maker's mark, an emblem of a migratory community, or a coded sign for clandestine exchange. The stairwell's sonic peculiarity might be explained by resonant cavities and human priming, but it is also a place where social anxieties about safety and disappearance collect. The repeating faces in photographs may indicate familial resemblance, the reappearance of certain individuals under different guises, or a cultural template that recurs because particular physiognomies represent a city's working population over decades. Ambiguous deaths may be structural tragedies, criminally exploited vulnerability, or an artifact of record-keeping practices that prioritized some lives over others. Each possibility sits alongside its rivals because history is rarely monistic. And there is courage in that ambiguity. To accept it is to reject the comfortable certainties of rumor and conspiracy that leap to explanations without rigorous ground. To accept it is also to refuse the sterile reductionism that turns living people into mere data points. The moral center of this investigation is respect. Respect for those whose names are crossed out, respect for the small things that survive, dots of ink, the curve of an earlobe in a photograph, and respect for the work of scholars who sift, count, and test without pretending to make the absent present. Our work is not to conjure villains with more imagination than evidence permits. It is to assemble the most plausible accounts we can, to mark where evidence is thin, and to leave space for the stories families tell when they cannot find institutional answers. So why do these mysteries matter beyond their own local drama? Because they teach us about how cities remember and forget, about which lives are counted and which are margin notes, about the way objects function as social adhesive across time and distance. The Cecil's oddities are not peculiarities of a single building so much as exemplars of urban processes everywhere: marginalization, migratory flows, the informal circulation of objects and stories, and the cultural habit of turning hole-filled histories into myth. In listening to the hotel's archive, we learn to read other places more carefully, to notice the ledger margins and the stairwell landings in our own towns, to question what is made official and what is consigned to rumor. The ethical impulse awakened by such inquiry is simple but profound: to insist that missing people matter, that small artifacts have histories, that acoustic anomalies should be studied not only to explain but to honor the lived experiences of those who heard them. Finally, what do we ask of you, the listener and reader? We invite curiosity with humility. We invite you to imagine, not to replace evidence with fancy, but to use imagination as a tool for empathy. Picture yourself, again, at the Cecil's threshold, the fog beyond the street lamps, the hotel's lobby breathing in rhythm with the city, a ledger open to a page with a faint spiral drawn into the margin. Picture the objects: a pendant worn smooth by decades of fingers, a photograph whose smile is half remembered by an old neighbor, a stair tread polished by thousands of feet. Those images are anchors. Let them make you ask hard questions. Who gets recorded? Who is allowed to vanish without fuss? What small things travel with us and why? If you care about history, care about the missing fragments, trace them, record them, treat them with the dignity archival practice demands. If you care about justice, press institutions to preserve rather than disappear records, to investigate where patterns of vulnerability appear again and again. We will never, perhaps, stitch the Cecil's entire tapestry into a single seamless cloth. Some threads are lost, some have been deliberately cut, and some will always fray. But the act of inquiry matters. To trace the spiral across time is to affirm that even small marks on paper and on skin hold stories worth telling. To map ledger margins and stairwell songs is to honor the people who moved through those spaces and whose lives, for reasons large and small, became difficult to locate in official archives. To listen to myths alongside spectrograms is to accept that human truth wears many coats: scientific, narrative, emotional, and that understanding requires us to wear them all at once. Keep listening, keep asking, keep digging, because the Cecil and places like it are not merely curiosities for historians. They are signals about how we treat one another in the everyday machinery of cities. Each unanswered ledger line is an invitation to care. Each missing photograph is a prod to remember. Each stairwell whisper is a reminder that the ordinary world carries traces of other worlds, lived, imagined, and sometimes mythic. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.